third public input presentation, and welcome Shane Bulletich, Julie Stout and Michael Goldwater from Urban Auckland and Stop Stealing Our Harbour, and they were participants in the consensus working group that put together the Port Future Study recommendations. Shane.
Oh, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Port Future Study, Julie Stout and I sat on that study over the course of 12 months. There were a range of findings, but the key ones are up on the slides. So the first one was that there was a recognition of tension between the CBD and the port, essentially a recognition that a CBD activity is becoming increasingly incompatible with a heavy industrial activity, and that as the two grow, something has to give. There was a conclusion that the port can't handle the long-term freight task. There was a determination that a port relocation option should be pursued with urgency so that we know what the future looks like for us and we have certainty around it. And there was discussion around triggers for when the port should be relocated, subject to the establishment of a port relocation plan. Now, the important thing I noted in the agenda that the triggers focus primarily on capacity and adverse impacts, which in my view are last resort triggers, and in fact in the Port Future Study itself it was widely acknowledged that we should move the port when it is in the best interest of Auckland to do so, and that actually is about optimal land use. When is it the best time to use that land for something different? The last resort is when we reach capacity or when the adverse impacts are intolerable. So we request that that's reflected in the stream of work going forward. We need to address some key points here so that Council's well informed. The first point is that the port's profitability is a false economy. I've heard the use of the term cash cow in the media widely, and that the port is somehow a cash cow for Auckland. It's simply not the case. Its occupation of the waterfront is a lost opportunity, and any economist will tell you that you have to make the best use of your resources, not take the lowest use. The port is only profitable because it pays no rent on an extremely valuable piece of land, and it inherits tax losses from other parts of council. That allows it to be profitable. Without these subsidies, it is an unprofitable business. As an example, you can see the port up there, 77 hectares of land. It gives you a sense of how big the port is relative to the CBD and what the opportunity is there. I've circled on the left there in Wynyard Quarter the new Datacom building, which generates by itself on half a hectare of land $44 million of profit and pays council $800,000 a year in rates. There may well be a leasehold arrangement there, that's not visible to me, but you start scaling those economics up and you say, how much could I extract from 77 hectares of waterfront land? I would suggest a heck of a lot more than $60 million, and on a commercial basis, and you get the social and economic productivity of that land as well. So council derives an income, the community benefits from a better social and economically productive use of that land. Does the port need to be in Auckland? No. The sole objective for Auckland to consider is the outcome it's seeking, and the outcome it's seeking is efficient flow of freight to and from Auckland. If that can be achieved through a port outside of Auckland's borders, through efficient rail and road networks, then so be it. It doesn't have to be within our borders, absolutely not. And we should embrace the possibility that another region would want to come and help us, partner with us, to handle our sea freight on our behalf, to allow us to use our resources for things that they're better devoted to. We should focus on what we have competitive advantage in. We don't have a competitive advantage in sea freight movement because our land is too expensive. Other regions have less expensive land and are better at it, and we should be devoting our resources to things we're great at and partnering with our neighbouring regions to get our sea freight moving to and from Auckland. Should we sell the port operating company? I know this is becoming a timely issue for council. In our view, we only if it's part of a guaranteed relocation process. We would simply not accept the idea of privatisation of the holding company, not the land, but the holding company, without it being part of an integrated and guaranteed relocation process. It's simply not acceptable to have wriggle room in that sort of deal that says, okay, we're going to give you the right to occupy our waterfront for a period of time and maybe we'll relocate, maybe we won't. That's a bad deal for Auckland. It has to be part of a guaranteed relocation process, and it has to have a finite time frame, and that time frame has to be relatively short. Each additional year that the port is in occupation of that waterfront is one less year of opportunity for current and future generations. Can relocation be fast-tracked? Well, possibly. There is the possibility, a reasonably attractive possibility, I think, of doing some sort of deal with Port of Tauranga. And certainly in the short to medium term, that is a viable option, and it has a number of attractive properties, one of which is that the Port of Auckland is largely import-centric and the Port of Tauranga is largely export-centric. So you end up with these empty containers being shipped to and from Tauranga, which is economic madness and entirely really costly and inefficient. The amalgamation of those two freight flows creates a really balanced port, and in our view, that would be a terrific underwrite for a port relocation at a time in the future. But in the shorter term, Port of Tauranga could come and help Auckland to remove freight from the existing inner city site to alternative locations like Tauranga and possibly Northport, which Tauranga has a 50% shareholding in. Our freight keeps flowing, our waterfront gets vacated for alternative, more productive uses, and everyone wins. You could also, if done rapidly, start to open up space in the very short term for things like the America's Cup and for cruise ships. We have enough waterfront space. It's how we choose to use that space that's the problem, and the creation of new waterfront space at high cost is simply not responsible. Exactly. We've gone over these points, so I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Shane. Questions of the group? Councillor Walker, Councillor Cooper, Councillor Clow.
So I'm picking up that you're suggesting that we need a port study for the Upper North Island, Tauranga, Northport, Auckland, with some urgency.
Yeah, look, it would help. I think what we need is open-mindedness. That's what we're asking for. What we're asking for is to start with the objectives we're seeking and not be beholden to any particular solution, whether that be boundary related or in terms of needing separate ports for separate regions. What we need to do is say the objective is efficient freight flow, efficient flow of sea freight to and from the Upper North Island, and the other objective for Auckland more specifically is the vacation of our waterfront land so that we can use it for more productive uses. If we can achieve both of those things, then we end up in a really good space in Auckland, and the person providing the port service somewhere else ends up in a pretty good space as well, because that's what they choose to allocate their resources to.
Okay. The other quick question I've got that follows on, you mentioned the lack of payment on the part of ports of Auckland. Is that also the situation with Northport, with Tauranga, with other ports? Is that the way we do things in New Zealand, and how does that compare with other ports overseas?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I suspect that's the case. It seems to me that ports have been granted the right to occupy waterfront spaces over a long period of time, and that's a legacy issue. So I would suggest that most of those ports are probably, in a sense, subsidised by the ratepayer, because the ratepayer owns the land underneath them, but the right to that, essentially that land is privatised by being gifted to the port company at peppercorn rental or very low cost.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. I'm just a little bit, I just need to clarify something. So you were on the Port Future Study group, but now, so have you come to say that you disagree with a lot of the recommendations?
No, not at all. It's moving the discussion forward. So the Port Future Study concluded that the port can't be at the bottom of town in perpetuity, and in fact it's
yes,
fast
I know what's
reaching
on the
its
report.
date.
Yeah, I just
so I guess it's moving forward. The Port Future Study was defined in such a way that was difficult for us to go beyond the borders of Auckland, and so a lot of the discussion was around serving Auckland's needs, and that's why Mayor Goff has rightly called for a more of an Upper North Island focus.
So, and the other thing, I just wondered, you talking a lot about tax advantages, and I see some of our stuff going, what, you know, and inefficiencies, etc. What evidence do you have to back that up? Have you got, because what I'm hearing is when people are asking you questions, you're saying, well, I don't know, but this is what I think. And so I'm a bit concerned. For me, I want to hear facts, and that's what concerns me, that yes, you have got your your views, absolutely, but I'm just, it's sort of, I'm
So-
just not
so-
sure where your if they're facts or where they come from.
What we do know
I'm going
about
to take
was
this seriously.
Yes, no, I agree. What we do know a lot about is the Port of Auckland, because that's what we've been primarily focused on. The Port of Auckland statistics, if you go to their financial accounts, you will find notes that indicate that there is no line item for rent. They pay nominal rates on the basis of a $300 per square metre valuation of the waterfront, when Wynyard Quarter is worth $6,000 a square metre, property across the road is worth $10 to $12 per square metre. And you will also find notes that note that their tax expense is significantly lower than it would ordinarily be, because they inherit losses from the likes of Watercare and other CCOs.
Thank
So
you.
that's from financial accounts.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Claude.
Can't help but, sorry, I'm a total supporter of moving the port at some stage, there's no question about that in my mind. But I can't help but think your latter slides contradict your very first slide, where it says relocation should be triggered when it's in Auckland's best interest. Yet by the latter slide, you're kind of almost saying we should be doing it very soon, including, you know, and the Port Future Study obviously talks really more about the medium term, 240 to 265, 255 being identified as probably a sensible time. Can you just comment on that first? That's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, Auckland's best interest means when the use of that land for a port is not as good as the use of that land for something else. So in our view, we believe that the opportunity for redevelopment on that waterfront is, you know, that now is the time to do that, or soon is the time to do that. And the longer you delay that process, the longer you delay all the benefits of redevelopment and relocation. So the Port Future Study is simply saying, if you took the last resort option, which is to wait until the port is full, then yes, you might be waiting to 240 or 250. But that's not a good rationale for land use decision. Land use decision should be on the basis that we have this piece of land, we're currently using it this way, but if we used it a different way, could we get better outcomes for Auckland? And we're arguing that we believe that using that land differently is a better outcome for Auckland, as long as we can find an alternative solution that keeps the freight flowing to and from Auckland. And we should be open-minded on how that alternative solution looks.
Okay.
It's also in Auckland's best interest for the second stage of the Port's Future Study to happen now, so that longer term planning for Auckland can be implemented with some surety.
Then you indicate that we could, if we were to strip away the port operating company away from the land, we'd have something to sell. But in reality, the value of anything to sell is based on a lease of some degree. Otherwise, if I was a director on the ports of Tauranga, I'd say, well, let's just sit back and wait, and we'll get it for nothing, and we'll get all that business for nothing, and let's just work together with Northport. And so what's your comment on that? Because the lease, it's what would give it the value.
It's an extremely, and that's our fear, is that Auckland Council does a deal to get the short-term gain from a sale, but you're right, the value of the port depends primarily on the terms of the land-port arrangement. So if the council decided to keep not charging rent, then the port can continue to be profitable, and if you give them a 30-year lease, then it has value. But that's not good for Auckland. That locks in the current land use pattern for the next 30 years, which is a terrible outcome for Auckland, and it reduces all our options. So your other point is absolutely correct as well. Tauranga is winning the port game. Whatever Port of Auckland will tell you, Tauranga is winning the port game. Maersk has come on board with them. Kotahi has done the deal with them. They've got the big ships in the deep water. And the longer you wait for this relocation, if you choose to do a deal with Port of Tauranga or anyone else, that the saleable value of the Port of Auckland is going to decline. So, there is a degree of urgency here. If you keep holding onto that asset, I don't see it appreciating in value because it's not winning the port game.
My third question was, say, in subsequent press releases that were made after New Zealand First made it a bottom line, was Save Our Harbour was very enthusiastic about the thing and said do it sooner rather than later. And I noticed, Julie, you came out with a press release that maybe was a little bit more considered and said maybe we need to keep all the options open, and a key thing is a as a port study. Is there a split between the two groups? Because you are joined at the hip, but it seems...
Can I clarify that? Basically, what we said is that we applaud any discussion about the efficient use of our waterfront. We specifically said that we're not port experts, so we didn't know whether the Mr. Peters' proposal was viable or not. But what we did was we applauded the discussion.
Julie, do you have a comment?
Yes, I think it's just obvious to both of us that this next stage of the study has to happen, and I think the political events of the last few months have exacerbated that. And whatever the outcome of this coming week as to what the ground plan is, it really needs to happen very soon to institute this study. But I think we all want to see what's best for Auckland between us.
Nick Off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Shane and Julie and Michael, both for your presentation, but for the work that you've done on this over a long period of time. I think it's been absolutely invaluable, and you've done it as volunteers, so really admire and appreciate that. I think possibly the wrong message came out from Stop Stealing Our Harbours. Maybe it's not your fault, maybe it was the media interpretation, but it looked like you were immediately endorsing a proposal to move Auckland Port to North Port, and I take a different view, and it's that whatever we do has to be evidence driven, and before you make any decision around the relocation of the port, you've got to have a business case that says it works economically and that it works environmentally, and I actually think you agree with that as a precondition. Maybe the best opportunity that Mr. Peters offers all of us is that this could be a way to get the Upper North Island port study and strategy that most of us think is a sensible way to move on from the port's future study. I'm yet to be convinced that either Tauranga or Northport could simply take all of our freight and that would make environmental sense either, given that we're going to be 2 million people and our port would be 154 kilometres away. I want to move the port, but I want to make sure that the decision of how and when we do it stacks up like you've suggested. And I think you're right, Shane, it's about the optimal use for Auckland. But what we don't want, actually, if I'm totally frank with you, we don't want 77 hectares of empty land immediately when we're trying to do Wynyard Point, we're trying to do Captain Cook Wharf and a few other things. What we want is that land available to us when we're ready to and can use it. And then we will get a better economic return. So, I mean, that's my summary of it. I just want to know if there's any difference between your attitude and what I've just expressed.
Look, that's exactly where we're at. We the media interprets things the way they will, but we've never gone on record to say we support Northland. What we support is thinking around how we get stuff off Auckland's waterfront. We're absolutely an evidence-led organisation and will continue to be. I agree and endorse that we need the right evidence to determine the best outcome. The point around proximity to Auckland, I think there's room for challenge on that because you can find efficient ways to move freight via rail. It's not particularly time critical. The environmental footprint of having two separate ports, I think, duplicated infrastructure is far more damaging than a single port a little farther away, and we need to keep that in consideration. But that's part of the longer term view, which might say the strategy might come up and say what we need to do is amalgamate these two freight flows because they're symmetric, they're opposed, but when they come together they build scale and sufficient scale to support the development of a new port somewhere sensible. And that needs to be part of the study. I don't think we can go into this just saying we need to only think about Auckland's needs and Auckland needs its own port and Tauranga needs its own port. So I think we endorse everything you say, and we'll be strongly supportive of that process and keeping a keen eye on it.
I think the purpose, thank you for that, the purpose of the Upper North Island Port study is to say what's going to work best not only for the city but the region and the country.
Absolutely.
And if we don't do that, then we're letting the country, the region or the city down. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Thank you. Councillor Mikely.
Thank you. I'm a great supporter of Stop Stealing Our Harbours, environmental concerns, in regard to reclamation, and I'm reassured that the Chair of the Ports of Auckland, the new Chair, has finally agreed with us and has agreed that there will be no further reclamation coming from Ports of Auckland. But leaving aside the environmental impacts and, I guess, the morality, if you like, of imposing those environmental impacts on more pristine parts of, say, the Hauraki Gulf, Firth of Thames and so on, I'm interested in some of the economic ideas you have in regard to the port. You are suggesting that the port is not such a valuable asset for the people of Auckland after all, because the profits are somewhat illusional, because the port doesn't pay rent. Now, are you suggesting that it should pay rent?
Well, I mean, once again, it's just out of one pocket into another. You could separate the land from the port and take back ownership of the land and charge them a sensible amount of rent. You know, if you conservatively assumed that was $1 billion worth of land at the moment, which I think is very conservative, and you wanted a 5% return on that, you would charge them $50 million a year in rent. That would take away their dividend because they become break even. Either way, I mean, at the moment you get approximately that amount of money out of the port. So it's how you extract the money.
I think you have to be careful. Are you suggesting that also applies to the Port of Tauranga and their shareholders, that actually their profits are illusional as well, and that because the Port of Tauranga, which controls a much greater area of land, doesn't pay rent either, or any other port?
Well, we need to be clear around it's not illusional in that it goes into someone's bank account, but it is a transfer of wealth from, you know, you're extracting money from the asset in a different way. So in the case of Tauranga, if they are under the same arrangement as Auckland, it's basically public land sitting under there that is being privatised, and the value of that land is going to the shareholders. As opposed to the people who might own the land under it. I don't know the ownership. I haven't looked in detail at Tauranga because it's beyond our scope.
I would advise caution on making those sorts of statements. In the end, if you change the profits to rent, as long as they went back to the people of Auckland, that would be valuable alternative income on top of people's
absolutely.
rates. So I don't think that's a strong argument.
No, the broader argument is to say, can we earn more than $50 million from that piece of land using it in a different way? And that's the economic rationale to say, is that the best we can do with 77 hectares of waterfront land?
Well, I won't get into a discussion. We could have high-rise buildings there blocking off the waterfront, but I doubt if we can get much freight or goods into Auckland that way, and they have to come in some way. And a port is probably the most sustainable way of getting those goods into Auckland, and exporting from Auckland.
I was just going to add that the location of the port's not just the economic thing, it's the impact of the port on the infrastructure and the transport and the surrounding neighbourhoods around it in terms of noise and pollution that flow out through Auckland. So it's not just the port itself.
There is the question of imposing those, what you believe, negative impacts on other people, on other communities, on more pristine environments. I think there is concern there.
Okay,
I agree. No one said that this is going to be an easy situation, but it's something we have to face up to.
Thank you, and neither does any port in New Zealand pay rates on the wharf infrastructure. They pay rates on land, but we totally subsidise them on the wharf infrastructure. Councillor Sayers, and then finally Councillor Fletcher, and then we do need to wrap this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I'm sure that's going to add to our debate on this topic. So my question's probably, just want to pick up on your comments around the parameters or the scope. You touched on that, how it's a little bit constrained, because, and we've mentioned Northport and you've mentioned Tauranga. From my understanding of the report, they aren't actually, that's not part of the recommendation. We're looking at the other two, aren't we? The Firth of Thames and Manukau.
Yep.
Manukau. So that's, I guess that's part of my question. My question, should, should that be included in there? And we've just spoken a lot about the sale as well. That's not inside the recommendations either. So can I just get your feedback on the comprehensiveness of how you feel this is being presented to us today, and is it comprehensive enough?
The Port Future Study is comprehensive in response to the task it was given, but it was within the terms of reference, and we were, I wouldn't say we were constrained, but we had to constrain the problem in some way, and so we responded to that problem in the best way we could. Discussions have moved on since then. It's been 18 months since that report was tabled. There have been discussions in the public around privatisation of the port and separation of the land from the port and so forth, and so we felt it was necessary to bring that up in discussion today, because that is going to be at the top of mind going forward. We are not proposing or have any preference for a deal with Tauranga or a deal with Northport. What we're saying is, let's start with the objectives we're seeking and work backwards from those objectives. The two objectives we are seeking are efficient flow of sea freight to and from Auckland, and we're agnostic about how that happens and who transacts that freight, as long as it keeps flowing in an efficient manner to and from Auckland. And we would like to see our waterfront gradually redeveloped to be socially and economically productive contributor to Auckland, and if we can get those two objectives and we can find an elegant solution to those two problems, then we get our waterfront back and our sea freight keeps flowing to and from Auckland. So I would start, if I was approaching this, I would start with those two objectives and then be very agnostic about what the solution looks like, not predefine the solution. One possibility might be going and talking to Port of Tauranga. Another possibility would absolutely be scoping out alternative port locations, but I think those just become options that you can run the ruler across and say which of these options is going to work best for us in the long term. So it has to be a very wide-reaching options analysis that starts with the objectives we're seeking and works backwards from that to look at the solutions that will deliver them.
And do you feel, sorry, just to clarify, do you feel these recommendations cover that?
I think they're, yeah, absolutely part of the solution. They should absolutely be put forward as options. So the Manukau, a port in the Manukau and a port in the Firth of Thames should absolutely be options that are considered. But we're saying think more creatively around the solutions as well, because there's another port provider in this country that probably wants to handle our freight and is very good at it. And if they're putting their hand up and saying, we want to help you solve your problem, we should be open to that discussion and see what they bring to the table. And there might be other options as well.
And that's referred to in the recommendations. So just to be clear, the people that we have before us were members, or at least Shane and Julie were members of the Consensus Working Group. We're not here receiving a presentation from the Consensus Working Group.
No, that's right.
These are two parts, and there were 17 members.
Yes.
So just keep that in mind.
However, we did come to an agreement of those 17 people.
And they are contained in the report, and it's on our paper today. And finally, Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to just get clarification that, given that the Consensus Group have reported to this committee, that you were here today representing Stop Stealing Our Harbour and Urban Auckland. So in terms of the weighting, recognising that you've been part of the group, but the representations that you're putting to this planning committee today are not those of anyone other than Urban Auckland and those of Stop Stealing Our Harbour. And as somebody who has been very, very clear that don't want to see any further encroachment into Auckland's harbour, I applaud the work that you've undertaken. So my question is, in light of the representations you've put today, you've put a lot of store on what's going to be best for Auckland. How do you, I mean, as somebody who's followed the cruise industry for several decades, it's cyclical. You know, you have ascendancy at the moment. Everyone's, cruising sexy at the moment. But we will see, and it's in ascendancy, but we will likely see, going into the future, some decline in the interest of people wanting to take cruising as an option. So you've put an awful lot of store on the cruise industry moving forward, shifting freight, allowing for the cruise industry. Do you want to comment further on that? Because I think we're charged with trying to find solutions for Auckland, looking out over a long period of time, understanding these cycles and what's likely to occur. Just want your take on that, because yes, right at the moment, very sexy industry, bringing a lot of revenue, fantastic for Auckland, but when that changes, what happens?
Yeah, so I'm a tourism economist. That's my day job, and I've done it for 20 years. So I do agree with you. The industries, tourism is generally a fairly cyclical industry, although the cycle is more of a stepped one than a big up and down one. Cruising is becoming extremely popular and has grown pretty rapidly. I think we're not experts in solving cruise ship port related issues. Our general point of view is that we believe that Auckland has enough waterfront land to deal with the issues it faces, and that we should be re-looking at how we're using our waterfront land and making sure that it's always for the best use possible, rather than just knee-jerk reactions that say put more stuff in the harbour. Let's just put more concrete in the harbour seems to be the only solution that we ever come up with. And we have got kilometres and kilometres of berthage on our waterfront that is probably not being used as optimally as it could be. And we need to start making some hard decisions on whether the way we're using that waterfront land is the best possible way, or whether, for example, Bledisloe Wharf, if we could find a way to scale the port back over time, whether Bledisloe Wharf with hundreds of metres of berthage is not the long-term cruise solution. It may well be if you can find a way to gradually take the port further eastwards. So, look, who knows how the cruise industry is going to go. Economic downturns come along and they tend to rip the heart out of the luxury end of the market. That might create some declines, but the issue with the cruise industry is actually one of ship length, not necessarily the volume of people. But we have a lot of long berths in Auckland. We're just choosing to use them to unload cars onto and unload containers onto, and maybe that's not the best use of that space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We need to leave it at that. Thank you to you all, and your, as the Mayor reminded us, your huge voluntary effort over several years now, which is not stopping. Thank you very much. So I'll move and second to Councillor Clow, receive the presentation and thank the participants. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. One last question, though. You've seen the recommendations before us. Are you generally in support of the recommendations that are being advised or recommended to us by staff?
Yes, we are, with the exception of the triggers. The reference to triggers seems to be very much focused on when the port reaches capacity or the adverse effects are intolerable, and we would like it acknowledged. It's actually in the Port Future Study that it also says when Auckland determines it's the best time to move the port, and that needs to be a trigger that is acknowledged.
Okay. That sits in the body of the recommendations, not in the officer's paper, but it does, and it is assumed.
Okay.
It is assumed by adding the word triggers. Okay, we can't go into the absolute detail, Shane, of every nuanced recommendation. It is assumed. If you can take our word at that.
Sure.
Okay.
But we do support the recommendations put forward to the council today, and we're thrilled to see it finally get to this stage, and we hope you support it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moved and seconded. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. A little break. Public announcement. Councillor Casey, would you like to do it?
Yes. It's World Homeless Day today, and there are activities in ATS Square from 9 a.m. till 3. At 12 o'clock, the homeless choir is singing, and they would love it if you could pop down. If we were let free at 12 o'clock.
Thank you very much. That's the public announcement. We'll go back to business.
Mr. Chairman, could we
I thought we were going to have a break.
so we could go down and listen?
Yep, it's, I'll think about that. We just need to get through some key business first. Priority is here, but I take that into account.